Leach, owner of the gallery, and the gallery next year will be celebrating its 35th anniversary, which is very exciting. So we're both going to kind of take turns talking through a presentation. It kind of gives a little bit of a sense of what we think, presenting what we do as a mission of the gallery around the theme collecting in context. And also talk about halfway through about some strategies for figuring out how to strengthen and build your individual collections. If you have questions throughout, just holler out one of our names, raise your hand. This is meant to be a conversation. There'll be Q&A at the end. But if you have a burning question during, just go ahead and ask. So also, if you happen to want to follow along in the digital realm, hashtag Potted Talks, and our Twitter handle is @eleachgallery, which is there if you want to. So I'm going to sit down so I can kind of man this as we go along, but just let me know if you have any questions. Do you want to say anything as far as the intro?
Okay, well, when I moved here in 1981 from, after being in LA and New York and Europe, I've been used to being around national and international artists. And so my husband at the time and I opened the gallery with the idea of bringing work in from outside. And in that process, we met a number of regional artists. So that has been the theme of the gallery, is to import the national and international and show the regional in that context. And it's exciting over the years, because I don't believe art is geographical, that some of the artists, such as M.K. Guth, have been the first artists from the Northwest to show in the Whitney, and that the collecting community has embraced both national and international. So I basically spent my entire life traveling and looking. Carol and I were just in New York at the Frieze Fair, and finding quality and value. And so it's really exciting because we've launched artists such as Dean Keeley, such as Isaac Lehman, into the larger community, and we've brought in artists that are hard to get. So Daniel has put together a beautiful presentation about some of the artists we've brought and just different ways that people can collect. So go for it.
Great, thank you. So where are we? Here we are in Portland, Oregon. How does Portland fit into the context of the art world? Many people would probably argue, especially maybe 10 or 15 years ago, that it really didn't. That's slightly changing a little bit. But when, as Elizabeth was saying, when she opened the gallery in 1981, her mission at that time was really to bring art to the region, because the perception of when she moved here from Los Angeles was that there wasn't necessarily a lot of art being made or being shown here.
We didn't see Richard Liebenkorn and people like that.
Right. So after being in business a few years, she realized that there was, in fact, quite a few artists here, and the mission really became about putting regional art within a national, international context. And so we often do shows like the one we're sitting in, PICA celebrating 20 years, that is about creating that context and that kind of dialogue. So does Portland fit in with places like New York, Los Angeles, London, Paris, Berlin, Hong Kong, Beijing, Shanghai? Not exactly, but we're getting closer. Maybe.
I like the ambition.
We'll talk a little bit about this, but we are a member, the gallery and Elizabeth are a member of the ADAA, the Art Dealers Association of America. Do you want to talk a little bit about
what the Art Dealers Association is? Well, it's a 100-year-old organization based in New York, and it's very difficult to be nominated as a member, and we're one of 2 galleries in the Northwest, and the only one in Portland. And so it's basically about rigor in your programming and academic work. So again, my background is as an art historian, so I'm curious. I follow art from that point of view, that the artists we show have a certain commitment to the whole conversation about art history, and that they're furthering that conversation. So, oh, you have a question?
Who's the other gallery?
Greg Becerra in Seattle. Greg Becerra Gallery in Seattle.
So I thought we just, because we're talking about being based in Portland and how there's what the context is, I'll talk a little bit about some of the strengths and weaknesses of the Northwest as a region and Portland as a major hub of that region. First of all, art prices in the Northwest. As many of you might know, if you travel around and visit galleries all over, actually the prices of artists in the Northwest are quite low if you compare them to other regions throughout the United States. So that's in some ways a strength from the perspective of a collector, because you can kind of get more bang for your buck, if you will. From the perspective of an artist, it may be as a weakness because they like to make a stronger living if the prices are a little higher. But I think that's the nature of the market here at this moment in time. One of the things that I think is a real strength is gallery and artists are really accessible. Many of us, as you know, we do First Thursday, we do preview openings, we do artist talks, and if you go maybe walk around Chelsea or uptown in New York and go, or even now in the Bowery, you go to galleries, they're just not quite as accessible to people walking up the street as galleries here are. So that's really a strength that we have as a gallery and as a community, that we really advocate for accessibility. So that people can come in, they can engage in conversation, and they can meet an artist, they really can get a sense of what's going on without kind of being intimidating, or at least I think that we're much less intimidating. I hope you guys share my assessment of that. There's also, I think there's a kind of at least a perceived remoteness to the region. I think that's shifting a little bit in terms of Silicon Valley and the kind of the Silicon Forest in Washington and now in Portland. I mean, we're feeling less kind of isolated, if you will, than maybe in the past. But with that remoteness comes a certain amount of impetus within the community that's here to strengthen the community and work to keep the community strong. It also, you know, Elizabeth, as she mentioned earlier, travels a lot. We're not really competing for the same market as some of our collaborators in New York or Los Angeles always. And so because of that, we are able to, Elizabeth is able to access a lot of things that wouldn't necessarily maybe be able to access if we were in DC versus New York. Portland versus New York, it's enough of a distance and enough of a different market that we really are able to access certain things because of the remoteness.
Right, and also a lot of our national artists will take more chances with their work, so there's a certain quality of innovation. Din Q-Lay, who shows in New York and Los Angeles, will initiate really special bodies of work, partly because we give them permission to do that, because artists should experiment. So, I don't know, we've been able to fill kind of a nice niche and have a lot of support from the region, from the collective community too, which is really important. You can't just bring things out for free all the time. But anyway, so it works, it can work in our favor to be remote.
And then sort of, are any of these aspects changing? As I already said, I feel like the region is, we sort of feel like the region is less isolated than perhaps it was at one time. But I also think that there was a sense that in many cases that an artist, in order to be successful, if they were from here, had to leave here and go somewhere else and then maybe come back someday. That's less so the case. There's a number of artists who are based here, some of them we show, and other galleries that show as well, who show here, they show in New York, they maybe show in Europe, and they're showing various places. An example that we'll look at some images later, like Julia Mangold is a German-born artist. She lives in Portland. She shows with us. She has a show coming up this summer at the Mies van der Rohe House in Berlin. She primarily shows in Europe, but happens to live here. M.K. Guth lived here, but was in the Whitney Biennial. Two others, Storm Clark, Jessica Jackson Hutchins, live here. Both have been in the Whitney Biennial. So there is some change in that regard. So what do we mean by collecting in context? I mean, we've touched on that a little bit already, but that image really is, this was the show that the gallery hosted when we moved into this space, or when you moved, I wasn't here yet actually, in 2004. so just about 11 years ago. And if you look at that, some of you might recognize it, but there's a Carol Pepper who's at the time was based in the Midwest, but is now in New York. Stephen Hayes, who's based here in Portland. Louise Bourgeois, who many of you may know, well-known French artist that lived in New York for many, many years. Kiki Smith, Ben Dallas, who's we're having a show with in September, another Seattle artist. There's a number of artists in there. It's about creating that context, that dialogue. So I'm just going to run through some examples. I'm going to try to do these fairly quick. This show, Pica celebrating 20 years, reflecting on the first decade, is really a show that is meant to connect with another institution in the city, Pica, who has part of their mission to feature both regional artists, local artists, and national and international artists, often performing artists. But at their inception, they had really, as they still do, a really strong visual art program. And they brought in a huge number of amazing artists here. Like Anish, for example, like Anish Kapoor. Many of you probably know the Cloud Gate in Chicago. People call it the Bean. Very, very famous piece. They also have these huge pigment installations. The piece on the right, the kind of gold color piece, is a gold piece. It's about 24-inch diameter. It was a photo I took at Art Basel, Miami Beach last year. But he's known for these huge installations that really shift your perception. And of course, he also does etchings. So these are actually maybe the image over there is a little better than the projected one, but you can really get a sense of this sort of shift in the perception. And I noticed when we were lighting the show that actually as we shifted the lights on them, they actually kind of moved. They really, if you walk around them and pay attention, they really are also about shifting perception. And so, as you can imagine, the price point for those different scales of his work are rather different. So part of our goal with accessibility is to make a work by someone like Anish Kapoor available. And he did show quite early on in their tenure. Another is Kate Shepard. And you were going to talk a little bit about Kate.
Well, just this particular piece was bought a long time ago, and it is from a resale from a major collector who actually bought several of these pieces out of Pica's shows. So it's sometimes nice to know what the provenance of an artwork is. And I think it's also nice to have conversations about the art. And she's very architecturally oriented, very minimal. And she also does beautiful works on paper. But it's nice to see that piece. It won't show on slide. I mean, we've brought other works by her and the colors don't reproduce. So that's kind of nice.
So another artist in the show, Jim Hodges. I put up a couple examples of his work. The one which is actually projecting really dark. It didn't look like that dark earlier. Is a piece of the Walker Art Center. So a big installation, playing with materials, playing with surface, creating this reflection. And another one that's also about perception and everyday materials, the pile of clothes with cobwebs on them, but the cobwebs are made of chain.
It's a good example. I saw a piece of his in, I don't know, it was the early 90s. It was $9,000. Oh my God, I wish I bought it. But, this piece, I mean, it's not inexpensive at $40,000, but we just saw 3 or 4 at the Frieze Art Fair that were several $100,000, all sold like that. The art market is so crazy. So we're lucky to have this. I'm sure the person who can sign that to me would love to have it back. But it's also a beautiful piece. It's a beautiful piece. There's a fragility to it, and I saw his show at the Walker. He's an artist, like many contemporary artists that work in multiple medium, and from flowers on a wall or a spider web to this gold. I mean, it's not always, there's a signature QQLA. Jim Hodges is going to keep you on your toes in a good way.
Also at Kay Gooks in the show, we have some of her dinners over here, which are performative pieces. But this is an example of one of the installations she did in this room, so this is where you were sitting. But also, like Jim Hodges, she's a local artist. She's based here in Portland. She's been in the Whitney Biennial. But she also works with everyday materials and perception of everyday experience. So this was, she wanted to change the light of the room. She created all these umbrellas with sweaters and coats and jackets and shirts and scarves, and then created these, what she called rain cloud chandeliers. And so they were available as individual pieces or as sculptures. But really, about using everyday materials, about changing people's perception, similar to Jim Hodges, but working in a different vocabulary. This is also her, this is actually the installation at the Park Avenue Armory in New York that was part of the Whitney Biennial.
She just recently was in the Contemporary Center at the, in Cincinnati, which the piece was an interactive braid that went to a really big collection, an individual. So it's fun. She's definitely continuing to get that national recognition.
And then two other examples, Tsai Kwan-chi, shown at Pica, known for these iconic images, him traveling around the world in the Maoist jacket, taking pictures in front of icons. But he's unfortunately has since passed away, but his estate is now represented by a huge gallery in New York, who's had a huge show in New York. They are work in many, many museum collections. And then Malie Jensen, aesthetic, totally unrelated, but a Portland-born artist, grew up in Portland, went to PNCA, spent
first show at Pica.
Her first show was at Pica, her first show out of school, and she's since gone on and lived in New York. She has a gallery in Chicago, a gallery in New York, and then here. And then Dinky Lay, I put up a couple other examples. There's obviously the piece behind us. Another one of their woven photographs is a Vietnamese artist. He had a really early show at Pica. We did a show with him right after or right around the same time. I wasn't here then. but it's up 15 years ago. But the time when we did the show, they were $5,000 to $8,000. He has since gone on with huge major shows all over the world. A huge show at the MoMA that was 9 months long in New York. They now range from $50,000 to $70,000.
He's going to open at the War Museum in July.
In Tokyo, yeah.
So we were his first gallery. It was really, and he's so loyal. It's very nice. It's a great artist.
And then I put up two other examples. The one on the left is a triptych that's in the Portland Art Museum collection, so you might have seen it. And then the other is another example that just kind of gave you a little detail of the weaving. And then just fairly quickly, some other examples. We just did a show a few months ago called Words, Words, Words. It's like another one of these group shows about creating context and conversation. One of the artists we just want to mention was Chris Johansson, who has a little colorful piece there in the middle of the wall. He's part of what is kind of called the San Francisco, the Mission School of Art. It's a very DIY sort of street aesthetic. He lives here part-time, in LA part-time. He's shown in New York, just shown in New York with Jeffrey Deitch, when Jeffrey Deitch had a space there. And we're very excited to have this piece. Did you want to say any more about him?
Just that he spent part of his time here and then part of his time in Los Angeles. But, yeah, it's a great artist.